8 billion people on the planet. It's a lot, right? Like, hard to even picture that many people.
Right.
And it seems like every time it comes up, the population, like the news is always doom and gloom. Oh, it's too many people.
Hmm.
But I don't know. Is that the whole story? So we're diving into all of that this week. And let me tell you, these sources you sent over, UN reports, we've got a CNN article, even a little sci-fi with Children of Men.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, right? Because it's never one neat little narrative, you know? Like, we've also got the Cato Institute's perspective on all this,
Yeah.
which kind of throws a wrench in the typical too many people fears.
Okay, so let's start with that big, scary number than 8 billion.
Yeah.
The UN, I mean, they make it sound like the planet's about to explode, but then you've got the Cato Institute saying, like, bring on the crowds, more people, more brains, more potential.
Hmm.
They're really connecting population growth to economic growth. Like, more people means a more prosperous world.
Yeah, I mean, that's their argument, and they make it pretty compellingly. Did they,
Yeah, did they have any, like, examples to back that up? Because
They did. Actually, this is where it gets really interesting, the historical perspective. Like, think about periods of huge flourishing, right? The Renaissance, for example.
right.
Or the explosion of invention during the Industrial Revolution. Those weren't exactly times of, shrinking populations. Quite the opposite. More people meant, well, more minds to throw at problems, which led to breakthroughs.
Okay.
So it challenges that very ingrained assumption that more people automatically equals, less of everything to go around.
Okay, that's actually making me think about this differently already. And this is where it gets kind of paradoxical. I think the same CNN article that's talking about 8 billion people also mentions that globally, fertility rates are plummeting.
Hmm.
So, like,
Mm-hmm.
are we booming or are we headed for a bust? How does that even work?
Because it's not just about the total number of people at a given moment, right? It's about the rate of change and what's driving that change. Well, that's the fascinating part.
Yeah.
Think about the last few decades, just massive shifts. Women are more educated, there are way more opportunities in the workforce, and access to contraception has improved drastically for millions. All of that adds up. Women having fewer children and having them later in life.
And, I mean, let's be real for a second. Kids are expensive.
Right.
Even just delaying parenthood for purely financial reasons, that plays into it too. But I'm guessing this whole fertility cliff, did they call it?
Yeah.
It's not hitting every corner of the globe the same way. Yeah.
Oh, you're spot on. This is where it gets really complex. You've got social factors, cultural factors, economic factors all colliding. Some regions are going to see much sharper declines than others, and that's going to have ripple effects we're only just starting to understand. It's not just a global issue. It's playing out differently everywhere.
Okay, so we're growing, but we're also potentially shrinking. Which, I don't know about you, but it makes you wonder, what does this actually mean for civilizations long term?
That YouTube talk with Simo Berja,
Yes.
you included that, and he went to some pretty intense places with this.
He did, yeah. And what I find so striking is how he goes beyond those, the typical overpopulation concerns. He's talking about the potential collapse of civilizations, but not just because there are too many people sharing, a limited pie.
Right.
Burge is worried about the loss of knowledge that happens when a population shrinks too rapidly.
We just forget how to do things or lose the people who are experts in certain fields.
Exactly. Imagine institutions weakening, the cultural momentum slowing down. It's not about having bodies. It's about having those live players, as Burja puts it, the people who are actively pushing society forward. And if their numbers dwindle too much, well, he uses a really interesting example from history to illustrate this.
Oh, okay. I love a good history lesson, so lay it on me. All right, so picture this. The Nuragic civilization, ancient Sardinia. They built these incredible, massive stone towers. Nuragi, thousands of them.
Okay.
But here's the thing. We barely know anything about them. Their language is mostly a mystery, their culture, even why they built those towers. It's all pretty much lost to time.
Because their civilization just vanished.
Exactly. And with them, so much knowledge vanished too. It's hard not to think about what else we might be losing even now as populations shift and change in ways we don't fully grasp yet.
Okay, that's both fascinating and kind of creepy. We do kind of take for granted that the knowledge we have is just going to, stick around,
Right. And that's what makes this whole conversation so important. It's not just numbers on a chart. It's about the very fabric of society, what it means to be human, and what happens when that fabric starts to, fray a little bit.
And what happens if it unravels completely?
Well, that leads us to Children of Men, right?
Right.
Which basically takes that idea. What if we lose all that knowledge and just like dials it up to 11, no more kids,
Right.
period?
Yeah, that one messes with you. It's set in 2021, and for 25 years, nothing. No babies, no toddlers, no teenagers running around. I can't even, like, can you imagine the silence?
It's haunting, isn't it? And that's just the backdrop. P.D. James, she really paints this picture of societal breakdown, this deep, pervasive sense of hopelessness. It's fiction, sure, but man, it makes you feel how fragile things really are.
Right. Like, we rely on that next generation coming up, not just to, like, take care of us when we're old and gray, but to keep things going, to keep discovering, keep building. And without that, I don't know, it's like, what's the point? I read that book in college, and it really stuck with me how much the characters were wrestling with that, the meaning of life when, like, humanity's on a deadline.
And that's where I think the novel goes beyond just the population question. It makes you think about the value we place on youth, on the future itself. Are those things we're taking for granted now in a way that, maybe we'll look back on and be like, oh, wow.
Big questions for a Tuesday morning. But see, this is what I love about this show. We get into the good stuff, the really juicy stuff. But okay, Children of Men, worst case scenario, thankfully fictional. But we did touch on some real-world movements and philosophies grappling with population in a different way, like the whole extinctionism thing. That one threw me for a loop.
It's definitely out there on the radical end of the spectrum, for sure. The belief, basically, is that humans are a net negative for the planet. Like, our impact is so detrimental that we should just bow out.
Intense.
Yeah.
But how do they actually see that playing out? Like, it's not like there's going to be a mass suicide pact or something.
No, it's more about a philosophical shift, really, aligning with ideas like deep ecology, which you're familiar with,
Right.
recognizing the intrinsic value of nature, not just its usefulness to humans. Extinctionism takes it to this extreme of saying, okay, well, the best thing we can do for the planet is remove ourselves from the equation entirely.
Wow. Okay, so that's one side of the coin. Then you've got the complete opposite, which, what did the CNN article call it? The fearful world scenario, where it's governments freaking out about declining populations, maybe even taking, like, drastic measures.
And history is full of those drastic measures, unfortunately.
Right.
Think about China's one-child policy, right? Or even today, you've got countries offering financial incentives, all sorts of perks, just to try to get people to have more kids. It raises some really thorny questions, I think, about individual choice versus societal good. Like, where do you draw the line?
Right, because who gets to decide how many kids people should have? And then what happens when those policies start to feel like they're controlling people's bodies, their choices? It's a slippery slope.
Absolutely. And that's why I think the resilient world scenario that CNN article outlines is so intriguing. It's not about forcing population growth, but about adapting our systems, our institutions, to a new reality.
Okay, so instead of freaking out about fewer people, we figure out how to thrive with a smaller population. What would that even look like, practically speaking?
I mean, think about it. Healthcare systems designed with an aging population in mind. Social safety nets that can handle different dependency ratios. Even economic models that aren't reliant on constant growth.
It's like a whole different way of looking at the world, isn't it? And maybe, just maybe, there's some, like, unexpected benefits to a less crowded planet.
It's possible. Less pressure on resources, think about housing, strain on social services. It's not a guaranteed utopia, of course,
Right.
but it's a perspective I think we don't hear often enough.
Totally. And this is where I think technology comes into play, right? We've already got automation changing the workforce, like, incredibly rapidly. But what if we combine that with a smaller population? Could we actually end up with a more efficient, more sustainable way of life?
It's a fascinating question. What happens to the idea of work when machines are doing more? How do we distribute wealth fairly in that kind of scenario? It's like we're playing a game where the rules are changing as we go.
Which I guess is the perfect metaphor for this whole population paradox thing, right?
Ah.
It's complex, it's unpredictable, and it's forcing us to rethink, like, everything we thought we knew about the future.
Exactly. And one of the biggest things we have to rethink, I think, is that idea of control. As humans, we love to think we're in charge. But when it comes to these big population trends, there's only so much we can predict, let alone manage.
Which takes us right back to Children of Men, doesn't it? Even though it's this extreme no-kid scenario, it really gets at that feeling of being kind of, like, caught up in something so much bigger than ourselves.
And the characters in that book, even facing their own extinction, essentially, they still find ways to create meaning, to connect with each other, to hold on to hope. It's a powerful reminder that even when things seem really bleak, there's always that human capacity for resilience.
Okay, I'm getting chills over here. But I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've covered so much ground already, and my brain is like officially fried. But there's still this one big question looming. What happens next? And maybe that's like the biggest takeaway from all of this, right? It's not just about the numbers themselves. It's about the choices we make, like in response to those numbers, how we react.
100%. We can approach this whole thing with fear, with a sense of scarcity, trying to control everything. Or we can look for opportunities to adapt, to innovate, to create a future that actually works for everyone, even if there are, fewer of us around to enjoy it.
Which I think takes us to this really interesting point about like individual choice. We've been talking about global trends, government policies, all this big picture stuff. But at the end of the day, it's individual people making decisions about their own lives, their own families.
Right. And those decisions are influenced by so many things. Economic anxieties, sure, but also changing social norms, access to education and healthcare, even a growing awareness of our environmental impact. It's not as simple as just saying, oh, well, people aren't having kids because of the economy. Like, there's a whole lot more going on beneath the surface.
Totally. It's like this whole generation is kind of like rethinking what a good life even looks like. Maybe it's not the, house with the white picket fence and 2.5 kids anymore. Maybe it's about prioritizing personal fulfillment or contributing to something bigger than yourself, or even just having the freedom to choose your own path.
Absolutely. And that's where things get really interesting from a societal perspective. How do we create a world where those choices are actually supported? Regardless of whether someone wants to have a big family, a small family, or no kids at all, how do we move away from all that judgment and pressure and toward a place of like genuine understanding and acceptance?
Okay, yeah. So big picture, how do we actually shift that conversation? Because right now, it does feel like we're kind of stuck in this loop of too many people versus not enough people, and like nobody's happy.
It starts with asking different questions, I think. So instead of just fixating on birth rates, let's look at the support systems that are in place. Do people have access to affordable childcare? Are there policies that make it easier to balance work and family life? Are we actually valuing caregiving roles in our society, both for children and for aging parents?
Because those things matter whether you have 10 kids or 0 kids. And it's not just about government policies either, right? It's about cultural attitudes. How do we create communities where people feel genuinely supported in their choices, whatever those choices may be?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, that's where I see some of the most exciting possibilities emerging. Think about the rise of like co-housing communities, these intentional living arrangements where people are choosing to share resources, support each other's families, create a sense of belonging that goes beyond the traditional nuclear family structure.
It's like taking the best parts of village life and like bringing them into the 21st century. Sign me up. But seriously, those models could be really powerful, especially as we face the challenges of an aging population and all the social and economic shifts that come with that.
Totally. And it's not just about practicality either. It's about reimagining what connection and care can even look like in the future. Maybe it's not always about, blood ties. Maybe it's about creating those chosen families, building really strong communities, and recognizing that we all need each other regardless of how many kids we have or don't have.
Okay, so much to think about. We've got these changing demographics, evolving values, technological advancements that are like changing everything by the minute.
Yeah.
It really does feel like we're standing on the edge of something completely new, completely unknown.
It can feel daunting, that's for sure. But it can also be incredibly exciting. We have this incredible opportunity to create a future that's more equitable, more sustainable, and ultimately more fulfilling, even if it looks different than what we might have expected.
So, big question now. Where do we go from here? If someone's listening to this and their head is spinning, hopefully in a good way, what's the one thing you want them to take away from this whole deep dive?
That the future isn't fixed, it's not predetermined.
Mm-hmm.
We get to help write the story, through the choices we make every single day. So let's choose to be curious, let's choose to be compassionate, and let's choose to embrace all the possibilities that come with a changing world.
Beautifully said. And on that note, I think we've officially reached peak brain capacity for one episode. But I have a feeling this conversation is far from over, right?
Never over.
So, like, can fiction help us face these, anxieties about the future? I guess that's what we're here to find out.
It's a really interesting pairing for sure. The Children of Men, it doesn't hold back, does it? I mean, when it comes to painting that bleak picture of what happens if babies just stop being born.
Yeah, no kidding. Right from the start, James kind of throws us into this like 2021, but not our 2021. Obviously, it's been 25 years since the last baby you were born.
Yeah.
Anywhere on Earth, just try to imagine a world without like the sound of children laughing, It's eerie.
Yeah, and James really emphasizes that with these descriptions of like empty playgrounds, right? And how
Mm.
they're just being like dismantled because they're just too painful, a constant reminder of what's gone. Then there are the Omegas, that last generation. They're young adults now, revered and feared, just for existing.
All right, the Omegas. It's a lot of pressure. And you mentioned we're connecting this book to real-world anxieties about declining birth rates. That podcast excerpt you shared mentioned some things that might be causing this, like societal shifts, economic pressures. Do any of those uh, resonate with you? I mean, based on your own research and all?
Oh, absolutely. And what I find so fascinating is how those very real anxieties are just like blown up, magnified in the novel. It goes beyond just, not being able to have children. There's this underlying feeling of hopelessness that just permeates everything.
That's definitely there.
And, another interesting point from the podcast was that irony of people living longer lives now. Like, we might have people living to 100, and this is a big but, with decreased cognitive function. You've been looking at all that longevity research stuff. Does that ring true to you?
It does, unfortunately. And it is kind of a terrifying thought when you really let it sink in. Imagine like a society where the oldest are running things.
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily, the wisest.
Right, exactly.
Which brings us to, I guess, our main guy, Theo Farron. He's trying to make sense of it all, right? Living in this world as, what, a disillusioned bureaucrat? I mean, he used to be an activist fighting the good fight, but he's given up, hasn't he?
It seems like it. And he's still carrying around the weight of his past, too. Losing a child, I can't imagine, especially in this world where every child is like this painful reminder of what's gone.
Mm.
And then you've got his relationship with Zan, his cousin, who just happens to be the warden of England.
Talk about complicated family dynamics.
Right. It's a lot.
Yeah, he's definitely carrying a lot of baggage. It's almost like, even on a personal level, Theo embodies that feeling of being stuck. Like there's no way out. Kind of like that capitalist realism the article talked about, feeling trapped. Even if you fight back, nothing changes.
It really is, yeah. It's like that feeling of being stuck in a system, even if it's failing all around you. And that's what James captures so well, I think. The whole oppressive atmosphere of England under Zan.
No alternative, like the article said. And it's interesting how instead of fighting against that feeling, the government in the book seemed to double down on control, right? It's all about freedom from fear, even if it means giving up some of those, basic individual liberties. Does that sound familiar at all? I mean, with the political systems you've been studying?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And that's, I think, where The Children of Men kind of like transcends that just being a dystopian novel about infertility. Remember that point the article made about it reflecting that broader sense of end of history anxiety?
Yeah, like we've already hit peak progress and now it's all downhill from here.
Exactly. And I don't know, it's a scary thought.
It is. And it's different from those other dystopian stories where there's at least like an escape route, right? Colonizing space or, finding that hidden utopia.
Right, right.
But The Children of Men, it's like it forces us to confront what happens when those options just aren't there.
Exactly. It's not about escaping. It's about how we cope when hope seems lost, And not just on like a big societal level, but even on that personal level too. And that kind of reminds me of when you were saying how the writer of the article, he was talking about his own anxieties, as a new parent, that like slow creeping fear that it might be too late.
Yeah, it's that fear of hitting the point of no return, isn't it? And, it doesn't have to be about parenthood specifically. It could be climate change, political instability, who knows? It's that feeling, though. And then, bam, right in the middle of all this bleakness, James hits us with this incredible twist. Theo bumps into Julian again, and she's pregnant.
Oh, wow. Talk about a glimmer of hope, right? Out of nowhere. What I think is so brilliant is, well, it's not just the shock of a new birth in this world, you know what I mean? It's how James digs into everything that goes with it. The personal stuff, the political implications, the religious aspects. I mean, there's a lot there.
Yeah, there really is, especially when we find out later that Julian's a part of this group, the Five Fishes. They're actively fighting against the warden's regime. But they're not just rebels, are they? I mean, they have this whole philosophy about, like, birth is resistance. Super interesting stuff. What do you think about that? I mean, does it hold up when you really think about it?
It's a tricky one, for sure. I mean, on the one hand, you've got this group, and they see Julian's pregnancy as like this challenge to everything, right? The system, the way things are, a
Yeah.
sign that humans can, overcome, even when things seem really, really bleak.
Yeah, yeah, I see that.
But then there's that other side of it, too, the potential for that hope to become, I don't know, dangerous, maybe?
Yeah.
Oppressive, even? If they're not careful, I
Oh,
mean.
I see what you mean. Like hope with blinders on. Yeah.
Exactly. And that idea, that hope can be dangerous, it ties directly into, well, what happens next?
Things really get intense, don't they? When Theo, Julian, and everyone else, they set off on that dangerous journey,
Mm.
constantly running, facing danger everywhere,
Yeah.
and having to make these impossible choices.
And it's not just the danger, is it? I mean, there's that constant, like, internal struggle, too. You can feel it, the weight of what they're trying to do, those ethical dilemmas, that fear that they might not, pull it off.
Totally. That scene where their car ends up in the lake,
Oh, man.
I was like on the edge of my seat.
Ugh.
James, she does not hold back, does she? You're right there in the chaos with them. It feels like Julian and the baby, they might not make it.
It's true. And it reminds you, it reminds you how fragile hope can be. And to think, in this world, nobody's experienced childbirth in decades. And the novel, it doesn't shy away from how, I don't know, how raw and messy it all is.
No, it doesn't.
It makes you wonder, if that ever happened, if we lost that, like, living memory of it, how would we even begin to approach it again as a whole society?
I don't know. It's a good question. And I think what really struck me was, well, the novel starts with this huge idea, right? A new birth being this beacon of hope for the whole world. But then it becomes about Julian, her own very personal struggle.
Yeah. I love that about the book. It grounds this, impossible event in the very real and kind of ordinary experience of one woman. And suddenly we're forced to think about the weight of expectation, the pressure on Julian, on the child. It's a lot.
It is. And it's not even just the pressure, right? It's how everyone projects their own stuff onto this baby. It's
Yeah.
like this one child is either the savior or a threat.
Exactly. And you see that throughout the whole novel, that ambiguity. And it doesn't really go away. I mean, right up to the very end, James leaves us with this, it's an open ending, isn't it?
It is.
We're left wondering what happens to Julian's child, what happens to their world.
Which, I guess, in a way, brings us back to our own reality, doesn't it? The children of men, it doesn't give us the answers, does it? No easy solutions. We're left with these lingering questions about, I don't know, what we value, how we define hope, what are we willing to fight for when everything feels so uncertain?
It's true. And maybe that's what makes it so powerful, It's not about finding all the answers. It's about sitting with those questions, really thinking about them.
Yeah, I think you're right. So I guess as we try to figure out our own complicated world, facing our own anxieties, our own uncertainties, maybe that's the challenge the Children of Men throws down. What do we choose to believe in? What kind of future are we striving for, even when we're afraid, even when we have doubts?
Big questions.
The best kind, I think.